Hello, I'm Mark Ochterman. Today I'm going to give a very brief introduction to Buddhism. I hesitate in a sense to use that word, but it is the one that we've inherited in English for this tradition. So, the Buddhist system can really be summarized in 4 elements: suffering, the cause of suffering, the end of suffering, and the way to the end of suffering. And the first, the so-called first noble truth or first holy truth of suffering, proposes that all conditioned being suffers, or another way to say essentially the same thing, all conditioned beings suffer. Now this has some difficulty relating to this language of conditioned being or conditioned beings. This is not everyday language. You don't usually talk about conditioned beings unless you're spending a lot of time in a philosophy context. So I'll try to unpack that a little bit. And it's also very important to understand that all conditioned being suffers, or that all conditioned beings suffer. And again, come back to that. The second point, that there is a cause of suffering, is a very significant point. The notion here is that there is a point at which there is not suffering, and then there is suffering. There is a before and after. And there is something that causes suffering. And that takes a good deal of exploration. The third point, that there is an end to suffering, is in some ways a correlate. It actually follows from the idea that there is a cause of suffering. Those things which have causes also have endpoints. So something that has a beginning has an end. Something that arises has a conclusion. And then the fourth point is the practical teaching. Not that the other 3 are not practical in many ways, but practical in the sense of programmatic. There is a program that one follows. There is a way to the end of suffering that one can study. I hesitate to say learn, because that often has the sense of, oh, now I have acquired it, and it is complete in me. Whereas if we really need to understand this as being a training which is an ongoing concern, and in certain forms of Buddhism, at any rate, even when one has reached a great deal of perfection, or when one has reached perfection in terms of the understanding of this noble truth, the fourth noble truth of the way of the end of suffering, having reached that perfection of wisdom, one is not finished, but has new obligations that in a sense arise from one's perfection. So again, to summarize, the four basic truths and the four really most fundamental elements of Buddhism, or of the Buddha Dharma, and I'll talk about that maybe a bit later as well. First, suffering. Second, cause of suffering. Third, end of suffering. Fourth, way to the end of suffering. So the first is all conditioned beings suffer. And the significance of this is that we're not alone. It's often easy to be absorbed in suffering and think, woe is me, I alone am dealing with this situation. But misery loves company, and there's plenty of company in terms of suffering. And often it occurs to us that there must be a cause to our suffering, or that it occurs to me that there is a cause to my suffering. But what I imagine to be the cause of my suffering may not be the actual cause. So the second truth is really to try to penetrate, really to try to understand what truly is the cause of our suffering, or what is the cause of my suffering, when we individualize this and take it on personally. And this is also useful for those who are concerned about others. On the one hand, that's very good. It's very good to be concerned about other people. That can actually be very helpful to your own way to the end of suffering. At the same time, we also have to recognize that to a very great degree, this is something that we have to do alone. Others cannot do it for us, although there is always to be had a lot of help. Not only is help needful, but it does arise at the moments when one needs it. The trick is being able to find it, because it's almost certainly available. It's just a matter of finding it. The third point, that there is an end of suffering, is very important to keep in mind, because as one suffers, it is often difficult to hold on to this realization that there is an end to this, that this is not a permanent thing, that suffering cannot be permanent, it cannot be eternal. It is relevant to conditions, it is relevant to conditioned being, and conditioned being is not permanent. So, again, the unpacking of this, of these four truths, the four truths are very straightforward to present. Let's go over them again. Suffering, cause of suffering, end of suffering, way to the end of suffering. That's you can probably recite it with me if I do it again. But to grasp these and to make them part of your life and to direct your life through them, that's another matter. It's the same matter, but it's a further advance, let's say. So, the end of suffering, first of all, is something that can give us a great deal of hope. So, you want your hope to be a realistic hope, but but we can be hopeful and we can be trustful that there is an end to suffering, and that end of suffering is something, furthermore, which we can bring about ourselves, or, to put it individually, the end of my suffering is something which I may bring about myself. Now, it may take a very, very long time, and it will certainly take a great deal of effort, and it needs the right kind of effort. So now we come to the fourth point, the way to the end of suffering. How do I bring this about? And here we come into another business, which we call the Threefold Training. So we've got the Four Noble Truths, and now the fourth Noble Truth can also be called the Threefold Training. It is the way to the end of suffering as part of the Four Noble Truths, but it can further be divided into three. Those three are wisdom, morality, and concentration. So, what is wisdom? Of course, it's a huge question. Potentially, what does it mean to be wise? What is the state of being wise? What is wisdom? Well, in the Threefold Training, which is the fourth Noble Truth, in the Threefold Training we say that there are two main aspects to wisdom. The first is holding the correct views, having the proper insight, understanding, so correct views, correct interpretations of reality. The second is to have a correct intention, to have one's will focused properly on what will really bring about the end of suffering. And both of these are very important points, each one of which can be, almost seemingly limitless supply of what we might describe as homilies or sermons or, expositions. So there's plenty to get out of this, but let's again recite with me the Four Noble Truths. Suffering, cause of suffering, the end of suffering, and the way to the end of suffering. And what is the way to the end of suffering? It is the Threefold Training of wisdom, morality, and concentration. And I've only gotten to the first one, which is right views and right intention. The second of the Threefold Training, second part of the Threefold Training, is morality. Some people might be unhappy with the word morality. We can maybe talk about that a bit later. But the breakdown of this in the Buddhist system is three parts in this case. Correct speech. You don't lie, in one sense, to put it negatively, don't lie. But don't lie to yourself. Say what you know. Don't make up, stories about reality. And when you aren't sure, say, I'm not sure. Don't invent. Be honest. Be frank, even, but certainly be honest. Secondly, correct action. The things that you do, if you wish, if you have right views and you understand the fundamental right view in the Buddhist situation is that there is suffering, that there is a cause of suffering, an end of suffering, and a way to the end of suffering. Okay, that's the most fundamental of the right views. But when you start to break all of that down and you start to look at what is the cause of suffering? What is it? What does it mean that there's an end of suffering? What can be the way to the end of suffering? As you put those elements together, those constitute right views. And once you have those right views, then you have also to have a right intention, the correct intention to reach the end of suffering, to follow the proper way to get to the end of suffering. Now, when I say proper way, I don't mean to say that there aren't many different manifestations by which the way to the end of suffering can come about. But certainly they all, whatever they all involve right speech, so not telling lies, being honest, being truthful in what one says. And again, it's what one speaks, but it's also your speech is based on what you think. So you're trying to have a clear understanding of what things are. So you're speaking to others, but also in a sense speaking to yourself. So you want that to be correct, and you want your actions to be correct. Don't do things, to put it negatively, don't do things that are going to interfere with your reaching the end of suffering. And the actions that really sort of direct your life are your livelihood. What you do as a job, what you do to afford your living situation, and so on. Your livelihood is the traditional way of rendering this in English. So, right speech or correct actions in a broad sense, and in a more narrow sense, correct livelihood or right livelihood. These three are morality. So, wisdom, again, is correct views and correct intention, just two things to remember. Three things to remember in morality: right speech, right actions, and right livelihood. And then, a little bit of quick review. Recite with me again. The Four Noble Truths. I did them in my head. Maybe you did too. And then we've got the Threefold Training, which is wisdom, morality, and concentration. So what's concentration? Concentration, again, we've got three. The first part of concentration is effort, correct effort. You can make a lot of efforts and feel like you're making progress because you're doing things. But are your efforts the correct efforts that will bring about the end of suffering? So we need to concentrate on right efforts. How will we be able to keep our efforts in the right direction? We need right mindfulness. We need to keep our mind focused on those things which we need to do to be able to bring about the end of suffering. And that will require of us right concentration, that is, correct concentration.